So I want to welcome everyone back. This is going to be our screencast for chapter 55, and it's really kind of crazy to think about, but we are finally at the end of the content that we need to study before you take the AP exam. So what we're going to do in this particular chapter is we are going to finish up basically what you need to know for the exam by talking about an area of science that deals with ecosystems. So when you talk about an ecosystem, we need to go back and think about the definition of an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is going to consist of all of the organisms living in a community. Now, sometimes what we do is we kind of forget that it's not just the organisms living in the community, but it's also the abiotic factors as well. Now, if you think back to Honors Bio, we had to distinguish between biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic meaning living, and abiotic meaning the non-living pieces of that particular ecosystem. Now, an ecosystem's dynamics, in other words, how it works, is going to involve two main processes. So what we need to pay attention to is we need to pay attention to energy flow, and we also have to think about the cycling of various chemicals throughout that ecosystem. Now, energy is going to flow through ecosystems while matter is going to cycle within the ecosystem. Now, we need to recall that energy itself really cannot be created or destroyed, but the only thing we can really do with energy is we can actually transform that energy. So, if we think about the energy entering an ecosystem, it's going to enter that ecosystem typically in the form of solar radiation. Now, we're going to conserve some of that energy, but there's also going to be some of that energy that's going to be lost, and in most cases, that energy is going to be lost in the form of heat. Now, every exchange of energy is going to increase something called the entropy or the disorder of the universe, in other words, of the system. And that's something we had talked about way back at the beginning of the year in AP Bio. Now, in an ecosystem, energy conversions are not completely efficient. In fact, it's actually a very inefficient system. And as we had said a little bit earlier, a lot of the energy that's actually going to be taken in, some of it is going to be lost as heat. Now remember, we had talked about energy not being able to be created or destroyed, but we also have to think about that matter as well. That matter cannot be created or destroyed either. In other words, it's just going to change form as it actually moves throughout the system. Now, ecosystems are considered an open type of system. So what that means is that the chemical elements within that system are going to be continually recycled within the ecosystems of that particular area. Now, as we talk about ecosystems, there are three things we're going to look at. We're going to look at the energy movement within that ecosystem, how the mass is affected within the ecosystem, and then we're going to look at the various trophic levels that are found within the ecosystem as well. Now, if you think back again to Honors Bio or Bio, we had talked about two particular groups of organisms. One of those was called autotrophs, and an autotroph was going to be that organism which could actually build its own food. In other words, it could build organic molecules. And typically it used either photosynthesis or it used chemosynthesis as the energy source to sort of give them the kickstart to be able to build or put together those organic molecules. Now, the second group is going to be the heterotrophs. Now, the heterotrophs are interesting, which is what we are, because we depend on the output of the other organisms for the energy that we need to be able to survive. Now, energy and nutrients are going to pass from a group called the primary producers, and typically the primary producers are going to be the autotrophs found within that system. Now, that energy and nutrients are going to pass on to a group called the primary consumers. Now, the primary consumers are going to be the herbivores, and then that particular set of energy and nutrients is going to pass on to the secondary consumers, and the secondary consumers typically involve the carnivores. And then we do have sometimes, depending on the ecosystem, another group called the tertiary consumers, which are typically going to be at the very top of our pyramid, which we're going to look at in just a second. These are going to be the carnivores that actually feed on other carnivores. Now, down here towards the bottom, this is going to be a really good example of a typical pyramid that you would find that involves all of the trophic levels that we just talked about. So everything that we had just mentioned right here, each of these is considered a trophic level. So if you notice down here at the very bottom, we have the sun. That's going to be our primary energy source. That energy is going to move into the primary producers right here. And then, of course, we're going to have the energy and the nutrients move into the primary consumers, which were typically the herbivores. Then it's going to move into the secondary consumers. And then, of course, we're going to have possibly a very top group called the tertiary consumers. Now, if you notice, we have a lot of arrows kind of going back and forth within this diagram as well. The arrows that are in blue represent the chemical cycling between the different groups. And then, of course, the arrows that are in kind of a reddish orange, that represents energy flow. Now, the really important thing to notice about this, in addition to the movement of the energy of the nutrients, is to notice, as we had said earlier, that a lot of the energy that these organisms will use, some of it actually will be released. And that energy is going to be released in the form of heat. And you can see that right down here towards the bottom. Then we also have a couple of additional groups. We have the detritivores, and if you notice, we have something called detritus here. The detritivores, which are typically either insects or maybe some microorganisms, they're going to be the ones that actually consume the detritus. So the detritivores, the decomposers, those organisms that we don't necessarily think about when we talk about an ecosystem, they're also a really important part in terms of the breakdown of those nutrients within the ecosystem so things can be passed back and forth. Now, when you talk about ecosystems, we talk about something called primary production, and you can see that right here. Primary production is the amount of light energy that is going to be converted to chemical energy by the autotrophs during a given period of time. Now, when you're talking about an aquatic ecosystem, what you're going to notice is that more than light, the nutrients are going to limit the primary production. In other words, that conversion in certain geographic regions of aquatic ecosystems. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about oceans and in various very large lakes. Now, we talked about something called limiting, and so we talk about things called limiting nutrients, and you can see that right here. This is going to be any element that must be added for the production to actually increase within that area. And typically in aquatic ecosystems, nitrogen and phosphorus are going to be typically the nutrients that most often are going to limit marine production. In other words, if you don't have a lot of these, you're not going to have a very high production in terms of nutrients within, or actually in terms of organisms within that particular ecosystem. Now, that's going to be for an aquatic ecosystem. Now, if we're talking about a terrestrial ecosystem, in addition to maybe these particular nutrients, this nitrogen and this phosphorus, we also need to understand that we're also going to have temperature and moisture as those that are going to affect the primary production, typically on a very large scale when you're talking about terrestrial ecosystems. But if you do bring it down a bit and you talk about it on a local scale, as I had said earlier, the nitrogen and the phosphorus that we had talked about in these aquatic ecosystems, they will have an impact on primary production within a terrestrial ecosystem as well. It just tends to be more local. So that's what we mean by these soil nutrients that you see identified right here. Now, what we're going to do also is we're going to talk about something called trophic efficiency and I kind of hinted at this a little bit earlier, something called ecological pyramids. Now, trophic efficiency is going to be the percentage of production that's transferred from one trophic level to the next. And typically they call that the 10% law of energy transfer. And this is something that you had looked at back as a freshman in biology. So approximately 0.1% of the chemical energy that is fixed by photosynthesis is going to eventually reach the tertiary consumer at the top of our pyramid. So this is going to be our pyramid right here. And what you notice is if you look at the sunlight at the very bottom, we have 1 million joules, which is the way that we identify the energy that's coming from the sun. And of that 1 million, about 10% is going to be passed up to the next trophic level. Actually, the first trophic level in this case in our pyramid. And remember, these are going to be the primary producers. So these are typically our plants. Now, then we're going to have 10% of this amount that's going to pass up to the next trophic level, which is typically the primary consumers, and they're showing an insect as a representative of this particular group, is going to be passed up to this group. Then we're going to have 10% again passed up to the next level, which are secondary consumers, and they have a mouse representing that, which are going to feed off of the herbivores that you see right here, is going to be passed up to this level. Then, of course, this is going to be our tertiary consumers. And so again, these are going to be the carnivores that typically feed on the previous group. But again, they really only pass about 10% of their energy up to this group as well. And again, don't forget that a lot of the energy that's not being used within each trophic level is going to be released as heat. Now, we also have something called a biomass pyramid. And in a biomass pyramid, each tier or level is going to be representing the dry weight of all organisms in that particular level. So, most biomass pyramids will show a sharp decrease at successively higher trophic levels. There is going to be an exception that we're going to look at in just a second, but I'm going to hold off on that one until we talk about this typical biomass pyramid. So this is going to be the pyramid of biomass. So this is going to be our standing crop that we're talking about. And if you notice, these are the terms that we're familiar with, primary producers all the way up to tertiary consumers. And so if you notice over here on the right, what we have identified is the dry mass that's found within that ecosystem. And so down here towards the bottom with the primary producers, you're going to notice we have a very large amount of mass. In other words, the weight of these organisms within this ecosystem. But then if you notice as we kind of go up in our pyramid, that mass is going to significantly decrease. And then if you notice again, it's going to decrease again as we go up a bit further. And then when we get to that tertiary consumer, that dry mass is going to be very different from what we had started off with. But as I had said, there are some exceptions. In some aquatic ecosystems, we're going to talk about something called phytoplankton. And phytoplankton is a little bit different because if you notice, the primary producers, which you see right here, which is the phytoplankton, is actually a little bit less than what you would find in terms of the primary consumers, the zooplankton. Because basically what we find here is that of this particular organism, there's a lot of them, but because there are so many organisms out there that actually feed on it, and they feed on it so quickly, that their numbers are actually not quite as substantial as you would find in terms of the primary consumers that feed off of this material. And that's why you kind of get this pyramid that looks like it's been flipped over instead of the typical pyramid that we would expect in most ecosystems. Now, biological and geochemical processes are going to be the things that actually will cycle the nutrients between living and non-living parts of an ecosystem. And we're actually going to do an activity that's going to illustrate this in class. So nutrient circuits is what they call these in ecosystems are going to involve biotic and abiotic components. Now, sometimes they'll use a phrase called a biogeochemical cycle, because what you're going to notice is the particular elements or parts of these cycles involve biological materials, geological materials, and then of course there are going to be chemical parts to this cycle as well. So oftentimes we have gaseous carbon, oxygen, sulfur, and nitrogen that occur in the atmosphere, and they cycle globally within our planet. But we do have what we consider less mobile elements, such as phosphorus, potassium, and calcium, that tend to cycle on more of a local level. Now, a model of nutrient cycling is going to include basically two things. We're going to have to look at something called the reservoirs, which could be organic or inorganic. And then, of course, we need to look at the processes that are going to be represented that actually transfer these elements between these different reservoirs. Now, we're going to focus on basically these four factors as you study the cycle. So once we get into our activity, these are the things I need you to pay attention to. We need to look at the biological importance of that particular cycle, the forms that are available or used by organisms in that cycle, major reservoirs for each chemical, and then key processes that are driving the movement of each chemical through its cycle. So real quick, this is just a really good example of nutrient cycling. And so as I had said, once we get into our activity, we're going to look at the specifics of each particular cycle. But if you notice, we have our reservoirs being represented. We have reservoir A, B, C, and of course D. And then we have various organic materials. If you notice, these are in green. And then if you notice down here, we have inorganic materials, and we have those that are available, and of course those that are unavailable. And then we have various processes like fossilization, the burning of fossil fuels, erosion, formation of sedimentary rock, respiration, photosynthesis. So if we look at the arrows, this just kind of gives you a general idea of how things move back and forth within an ecosystem. But like I had said, we're going to get into the specifics of each particular element and its cycling once we do our activity. Now, it's really important that we do not forget about decomposition when we talk about nutrient cycling. So we have to pay attention to the decomposers, and we have to pay attention to also a group called the detritivores. Now, decomposers, detritivores, are going to play a very key role in the general pattern of chemical cycling. So the rates at which nutrients are going to cycle in different ecosystems is going to vary really greatly depending on the ecosystem that you're looking at. And it varies mostly as a result of the differing rates of decomposition within that ecosystem. And that decomposition is going to be controlled by temperature, moisture, and the availability of nutrients within the ecosystem. Now, we can't complete this screencast without talking about a few of the human-caused influences to nutrient cycling. And so the first one we're going to look at is something called agriculture. And agriculture involves the quality of the soil, and it's going to vary with the amount of organic material that you find within that soil. Agriculture, unfortunately, tends to remove this organic matter from the ecosystems. In other words, it removes the nutrients, mainly nitrogen, that would originally be cycled back into the soil. Sometimes what nature will do, of course, is that if we have any type of vegetation that dies back, it's going to be put back into the soil because it's going to decompose. But when you participate in agriculture, typically you don't put that crop back into the soil because you're going to harvest that crop. So we're taking away those nutrients that typically would be put back. So industrial produced fertilizers will be used to replace the lost nitrogen, but unfortunately, as we put that nitrogen back into the soil artificially, it does tend to have a negative impact on the ecosystem. Now, we also talk about something called aquatic contamination, and sometimes we use the phrase critical load for a nutrient that we're looking at because it is the amount that the plants can actually absorb within that aquatic ecosystem without damaging the ecosystem. And the unfortunate thing is, oftentimes it is exceeded with excess nutrients that possibly could be found on land, but then due to runoff, makes its way into an aquatic ecosystem. So excess amounts of these nutrients will often contaminate groundwater, as well as freshwater and marine ecosystems. And this causes something called eutrophication because we have these excess nutrients. And what it does is it causes excessive algae growth. And when you have excessive algae growth, the unfortunate thing is it often affects other organisms within the ecosystem as well. Then we have something called acid precipitation. And acid precipitation, sometimes called acid rain, is basically the result of combustion of fossil fuels that are going to basically release various different types of chemicals into the atmosphere. And typically it releases nitric and sulfuric acids into the atmosphere. And so the unfortunate result from that is that we have something called acid precipitation, sometimes called acid rain. And what that does is when the moisture actually makes its way back to the soil, it tends to change the soil pH. And if you change the pH of the soil, it can have a really drastic effect on various wildlife, in particular the plants that are growing in that area. Now, we also have something called, of course, toxins. So we introduce toxins, unfortunately, into the environment occasionally as well. And the sad thing about these toxins is that they can actually become more concentrated in successive trophic levels. And what that means is that as you move your way up that pyramid, it becomes more concentrated in our higher level consumers. And oftentimes we call that biological magnification. And what that means is, as we had said, it's going to concentrate those toxins at those higher trophic levels. And you can see that occurring over here on the right with the example that we have here. So if you notice down here towards the bottom, we have phytoplankton and we have zooplankton. Well, depending on the amount of contaminant or toxin in the environment, and in this case we have something called PCBs, which are called polychlorinated biphenyls, but these PCBs make their way into the phytoplankton and the zooplankton, and the unfortunate thing is they're taken in by these fish. But because these fish take in so much of this particular organism, they become very concentrated because they're not excreted, because they're actually stored within the tissue. Then, of course, as you have larger fish within that ecosystem consume these smaller fish, then of course it becomes even more concentrated in these fish because we don't have quite as many of them. And then what we have is we have the birds that maybe feed on these fish and they take in that contaminant as well. And the really sad thing about this is that contaminant actually through body processes can make their way into the offspring of that animal as well, or even cause that particular animal not to be able to produce offspring. And so the last two things that we need to mention just really quickly is something called greenhouse gases. And the unfortunate thing with greenhouse gases is that it can cause something called global warming. And then we're also going to really briefly mention something called ozone depletion. Now, greenhouse gases or global warming basically refers to the increased levels of atmospheric CO2 or carbon dioxide that is primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels and any other human activities on this planet. So, CO2, water vapor, and other greenhouse gases reflect the infrared radiation back towards the Earth. And so, this is something that's normal. In other words, this is something that needs to occur. This causes something called the greenhouse effect. In other words, this helps to keep the surface of the Earth warm. So, it's something that's supposed to happen. But unfortunately, because of what we do, we've increased the levels of atmospheric CO2. And so this is basically magnifying the greenhouse effect. In other words, making it much, much more intense. And this is causing global warming and primarily climate change on our planet at a much greater rate. Now, as I had said, we also need to mention something called ozone depletion. And ozone is basically a layer that we find in our atmosphere that actually protects us from the damaging UV radiation that's produced by the sun. And so this ozone are just these various molecules, primarily oxygen, in a different form that, again, as I had said, is going to protect us from these UV rays. And so again, because of our actions, what we've done is we've put certain things into our atmosphere that is basically damaging the ozone. So those things that I'm referring to are CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons. And these are basically produced by human activity, and as I had said, are going to primarily destroy the ozone. So it kind of takes away that protective layer that is basically keeping us safe from that UV radiation. All right, so that's going to finish up this very last screencast, as I had said, before you take the AP exam. And as always, please make sure that you have completed your screencast study guide.